Yesterday evening, Radio 4 broadcast a programme about maternity care at the Countess of Chester Hospital. This was a pretty explosive broadcast, and in this video I'm going to review this programme. So it began with some context on maternity failings across Britain as a whole. On the screen now you can see the recent issues related to the Nottingham NHS Trust, which were of course extremely serious, and there was a kind of introductory section where we immediately heard some shocking stuff in related to parents from the Countess of Chester whose infants have been treated at the Countess of Chester. Now we're going to go over that in more depth as this video continues, so I won't go over that initial montage at this point in time. The question at the heart of this documentary is the following: was the quality of maternity care at this hospital properly considered in the Lucy Letby case? Now, those of us that have been following this case for some time already would have a strong suspicion regarding the answer to that question, but this programme delved into this further still. So there was then a montage related to the examination of the maternity notes, and we heard from this gentleman, Dr. Dewi Evans, who was the primary prosecution witness. Now, it's worth noting that Evans previously stated in relation to the Countess of Chester that firstly he said the quality of care at the hospital was very good, and I noted that one of the things he said was that there were outstanding efforts to intubate and resuscitate infants at the hospital. Now, that runs rather contrary to what we know about the hospital now. So the first parent that we heard from in this documentary goes by the name of Annie Vegra, and she was more than a week overdue in her pregnancy and suddenly began bleeding. This was recounted to us during the documentary. She went into hospital and was sent home when she started bleeding. And she recounted how they weren't concerned about the blood at all. They weren't particularly bothered, to use her expression, and they told her, "You're nowhere near dilated enough to stay in, go home." And at that moment, as she again recounted, her full waters gushed all over the floor, but they still sent her home. Now, it was explained by Annie that she was stuck at 8 centimetres for 8 hours, as she put it. Now, this might not mean a lot to everyone. It's not something that I know a great deal about, so I'm going to recount this as accurately as I can, and you'll hear more from experts later in the week. So being stuck at 8 centimetres dilation for around 8 hours suggests a prolonged labour, specifically a prolonged active phase of the first stage of labour. By 8 centimetres, a woman is in active labour and would usually be expected to continue dilating to 10 centimetres. Remaining at 8 centimetres for many hours tends to indicate the labour is not progressing adequately, sometimes called labour arrest or protracted labour. So prolonged labour can be physically exhausting for the mother and may increase the need for interventions such as augmentation with oxytocin, assisted delivery, or ultimately a Caesarean section if progress does not resume. So we're going to hear those things referenced as we continue through this review of the documentary. So the fetal effects are that clinicians would typically increase monitoring the baby's heart rate and the mother's condition, because the longer labour continues, the greater the opportunity for complications to develop, although it's still perfectly possible that there can be a recovery, but this monitoring that I just mentioned is critical. There is also a risk of infection if membranes have been ruptured for a prolonged period. Now, contrary to there being an increased degree of monitoring, the mother recounted that she didn't remember seeing anyone at all during this time, and then suddenly things escalated. She stated that the baby was showing signs of distress and that the hospital had to get her out immediately. Annie's mother-in-law, whose name was Fiona, was present, and Annie recounted that the room suddenly became quite full and that she began panicking. And then Esme came out, and initially Annie didn't think she was even alive. She just essentially flopped down, and people at the hospital whipped her up and took her over to the crib and were working on her because there were serious problems, and then there was a cry. It wasn't entirely clear from the programme where the cry emanated from, but Annie was obviously very concerned because she had had 3 children and she knew that things weren't right. And she had an infection and the infant had an infection. As I've just recounted, this can be a risk, and that had occurred. So she actually commented quite astutely that she assumed the infection came from waters being so far in advance and this protracted birth, and that's very likely the case. So she was given antibiotics as a form of treatment, but at this stage, understandably, the mother was losing faith in the hospital. So the next part I found thoroughly extraordinary. There were more distressing moments in the documentary, but I just think what I'm about to describe is utterly shocking. So Annie had a cannula fitted, and there was some problem where she got it caught on something or something along that nature, and then there was it began bleeding and there was blood all over the place, and she called for nurses, and one of the nurses told her, well, that's a shame, crack on and clean it up, basically, while she was still bleeding. Now, I found this to be incomprehensible, astounding, really, because I've had a cannula fitted. Firstly, I don't know how many people listening to this have. It's not very comfortable. Just on its own, it's not a comfortable thing, let alone if you're going through a very difficult medical procedure and you're unwell to the extent that Annie was. But I can't see any circumstances in which a patient should be told, right, there's blood on the floor, you clean it up. Let alone if you're in maternity, let alone if you're in maternity and it's related to a cannula. It just is grotesquely unprofessional. And it's really indicative of very poor standards in the hospital. So there was a very close call for this daughter of Annie, who's called Esme. And then she went on to talk about her second pregnancy and second maternity experience at the Countess of Chester. So once Esme had recovered, as Annie described, she was such a delight that she couldn't wait to have another baby. So she was back at the Countess of Chester in 2016, hoping for a different birth procedure, as she put it. Now, before we go any further, it's important to note this is right across the indictment period associated with the conviction of Lucy Letby. So we're seeing a very similar time with what we can reasonably presume are very similar conditions and certainly very similar staffing. So in this second pregnancy, Annie recounted serious problems with her son Archie making grunting noises from birth, and yet the attitude on the unit was, oh, there's no need to make a fuss, you're blowing things out of proportion. She described there being no urgency and no one was bothered about the problems that she was experiencing and could see her son experiencing. So Annie started to feel unwell and she was fainting and started shouting for assistance, as you would under those circumstances. And she recounted the fact that no one came to assist her. So we've spoken about this on the channel previously, and I've written about this in my book. The lack of attentiveness and the lack of monitoring. Now, monitoring is so important in maternity and neonatology. It's critically important because situation can deteriorate very rapidly, and there are potentially life or death circumstances both for mother and infant. So it's critically important. This is why the ward rounds at the Countess of Chester, the lack of ward rounds, have been so strongly criticised. And that's absolutely correct, but it seems it's not just the ward rounds, although that's absolutely symptomatic and emblematic of the problems, but it's also just a general lack of attentiveness and general lack of monitoring that is so important and yet was so obviously lacking. So Annie then recounted her son being sleepy for a long period of time, and there was suspected sepsis and a bowel condition. This may be familiar to you from the Lucy Letby case. And she was told repeatedly that Archie was doing well, but she wasn't convinced. She felt instinctively that there was something wrong. And she described this herself as an instinct that something just wasn't right. He wasn't waking up to feed. He wasn't latching on the way that would be expected. She didn't hear the infant cry even once. None of the normal indicators of a healthy and developing baby. And she particularly noted the sleepiness in this infant, and she was told, oh, that's just the way he's entered the world. It's absolutely fine. If you've had a general anaesthetic, it will have gone into the infant, and that will make the infant sleepy. But yet every day, Archie was still sleepy. That's how the words that she used. And she was conversing with her sister, and her sister was saying, I don't know if he's brain dead or if there's something else going on, but something very obviously isn't right. And Annie recounted that the signs were probably there, but no one was looking at it. None of them took the time to look, in her words. And this is what we've seen throughout the Lucy Letby case, throughout the indictment infants. There were signs of deterioration and decline in these infants, and they missed them for two reasons: lack of expertise and competence on the unit, and lack of attentiveness and monitoring. And you're seeing exactly the same thing here happen again in these infants associated with this Radio 4 Phylon 4 documentary. So the infant went on to have suspected necrotizing enterocolitis, and there were major problems with this infant, despite the fact that there was a complete lack of attentiveness on the unit and a reluctance to accept the fact that the infant was suffering and the infant was struggling, and indeed the mother was struggling. So with regard to her son, Annie said the following: I think Chester could have kept a closer eye on him or just taken my concerns as a mother a bit more seriously, but they were clearly struggling. It was very clear that they weren't coping with the amount that was going on. So I think if the baby's sleeping, he's not waking up to feed, or won't latch properly or cry, that's not a well baby. There's definitely something else going on, and I don't know for what reason that didn't red flag in anyone's head. So to deal with the first of those comments, firstly, we know what was going on in this unit. We know the number of multiple births. We know the acuity of infants. We know the problems they were having. We know the deaths that had already occurred by this stage. So it's obvious that they were understaffed. It's obvious they were underskilled. It's obvious that they made medical errors and errors in terms of diagnosis with numerous infants from the Lucy Letby case. But I think there were other infants that there were clearly misdiagnoses because they were treated as suspicious, and they were referred to the police as being suspicious, and yet nothing happened. And nothing happened for various reasons that I've discussed countless times. So let's move on to the second problem. In terms of not red flagging in anyone's head, as it's been described, it's because they missed the subtle signs due to a lack of monitoring, due to a lack of attentiveness, and then there wasn't the skill set, there wasn't the experience, there wasn't the quality and calibre of both nurses and doctors on the unit. But it seems, based particularly on the next story we're going to hear and what we've heard previously, that there was a distinct absence in terms of consultants or even junior doctors on the unit. So then we heard from Cleuci de Oliveira, who many people will be familiar with from her excellent Trials of Lucy Letby X.com account, and she's also been involved in another several of the other projects related to the Lucy Letby case. So she was talking about the increase in stillbirths that has been cited previously. This is something that we believed to be of significance, but Cleuci introduced this new maternity review that occurred at the hospital that was conducted by a consultant, which examined 18 stillbirths and neonatal deaths, and this found fundamental mistakes and fundamental issues at the Countess of Chester, including the incorrect measuring of heartbeats. Now, this was not only not revealed during the court case, it only came to light after the trial had been completed. So that's obviously very significant. We then moved on to another parent, Freya, who was pregnant with her first child. This was in 2019, so this is shortly after Lucy Letby has been arrested for the first time. So this mother, again, had had something of a traumatic pregnancy, noticing heavy bleeding during contractions, not something that you would tend not to notice. And she was told that a consultant would keep a close eye on her due to health concerns, and also because the infant, her baby, didn't move a great deal during pregnancy. So Freya, regarding this, said the following: "We didn't see a consultant, even though we were high risk. We explained medical history about the fact that the infant didn't move, all of those things, and from the get-go they couldn't identify Oscar's head position. So, having been promised, and they should have seen a consultant, they did not see a consultant at all." Now, this is echoing what we've already seen in Lucy's case with the indictment infants, where there is a lack of attentiveness and specifically a lack of consultant presence. So Freya was given oxytocin this is a drug that's given to increase contractions. Mentioned it earlier in the video. As I said, it would actually come up with these infants. At this point, Freya describes there being bright red blood emanating from herself everywhere, and that she's in quite a lot of pain, and the baby's head still hasn't moved. So similar to the 8 centimetre thing that I was discussing and describing and explaining earlier, this is obviously a bad sign. So at this point, having been in hospital for quite some time, having had multiple health issues, problems with the baby, this is a very serious situation. Finally, Freya was seen by a registrar. This is the first doctor they've seen at this point. Again, important to reiterate, they've never seen a consultant. They should see a consultant because they've been told explicitly that this is a high-risk pregnancy. Unfortunately, things are going to get much worse than being merely a high-risk pregnancy. So I must say that the next part of this story is distressing. Frankly, the whole programme was distressing, but I just want to make that comment before we continue. So as it turned out, Freya required a Caesarean section or C-section, and before this very delicate, very important, obviously, procedure took place, she was not examined again. And then trainee doctors at the hospital performed this operation. So again, there's no consultant presence whatsoever. Now, the Caesarean section went badly wrong. They couldn't get Oscar out from the Caesarean section, and a consultant obstetrician had to step in. That was the first contact that Freya had with any consultant at the hospital. And in the programme, she described the scene at the Countess of Chester during her maternity and at this point of the birth. There's like a flurry around the table. My body is, the best way to describe it is like what you would see on movies. It's like an exorcism. I am moving across the bed a bit like a snake, where my body is being pushed and pulled. I am shaking. I'm like fully with fear, with adrenaline, with the anaesthetic. I don't feel great. So you can perhaps imagine, or perhaps not, it's certainly difficult for me to imagine. Obviously, I can't go into labour. But the level of trauma at this point must be quite high. You're worried for your baby. You're worried for your own health, probably as well. You're going through what are difficult physical processes anyway. They're going badly wrong. The hospital's not reacting to them properly. You're not being given the care that you were promised. This is all enormously traumatic. So with Freya, they then had to cut her abdomen to get the baby out, and by the time the infant had been delivered, Oscar, there's no respiratory output, no heartbeat. So obviously this is very serious, and the parents of the infant were asking, what is going on? What is going on? And at the same time, the mother is essentially bleeding out on the table. She reports feeling awful. She's under general anaesthetic. And I said Oscar because that's how they named the infant, because they were told at this point, you're going to have to name him, which, as the mother rightly pointed out, screams that something is awfully wrong. Like, the infant is being named because there's a serious chance of death. And Freya reported being terrified that if she went under the general anaesthetic that they were suggesting, they were saying you need to go under an anaesthetic. She was terrified, as she put it, that she would wake up with a dead baby, and those fears were definitely not unfounded. Even at this point, although the situation is serious, it should have been possible to resuscitate Oscar successfully, but the hospital delayed getting the right people in the room. They took 22.5 minutes to administer adrenaline. Again, this is all the signs of what we see in the indictment infants: basic delays in fundamental procedures, lack of attentiveness, lack of presence on the unit, lack of any consultant input, and ultimately they very sadly failed to save Oscar. Now, I must say that the mother was, I think, phenomenally brave while recounting this. I think incredibly brave to come forward in the first place, but also the way she spoke with such clarity and composure about something that must have been, it will be, let's use the JRAM phrase, it'll be etched on her brain for the rest of her life, obviously. And the way she spoke about it was, I think, heroic, frankly. So there was then, as there should be, an inquest into this very avoidable death. It's obvious that there were failings at the hospital. There were unacceptable delays. There was no consultant presence. There was a lack of attentiveness. There were clear medical errors. But the inquest concluded that this infant died of natural causes. Understandably, the parents do not accept this. So Freya said during the documentary, my baby did not die of natural causes. He died of neglect. He died of systemic failings. And that is the reason why other babies are dying. And of course that applies not only to the Countess of Chester, but other hospitals as well. We've seen this. This is part of a much broader maternity scandal. It's becoming increasingly clear, I would say crystal clear at this point, that what we have with the Countess of Chester and the indictment infants and the supposed crimes of Lucy Letby is just another maternity failing. It's very obvious now. Initially, when I sort of began this journey, I could see that it was a wrongful conviction, and I could see that mistakes had been made both in the investigation and at the hospital, but we have so much more detail and picture now regarding exactly what occurred, and it's very obvious that it's a similar situation to Nottingham. It's a similar situation to the other maternity scandals that have taken place. And the comments here of Freya are just absolutely hitting the nail on the head, frankly. So, understandably, the family didn't wish to accept this verdict that seems deeply unsatisfactory. So they commissioned a consultant neonatologist and a professor of obstetrics to review, I would say, this very avoidable death. The opinion of the obstetrician was that the injury that caused Oscar's death happened while they were trying to dislodge his head. He said Oscar should have been delivered 2.5 hours earlier, and if he had been, his head wouldn't have been stuck and he could have been delivered safely. Now, this was another situation that's really important because the parent, the mother, is trying to draw attention to the problems, to what she's feeling. Like, she knows her own body, she can feel what's happening. And that was essentially dismissed, and as a consequence of that, the delivery was delayed. Also, because there was no consultant input and no consultant contact, these problems were not identified, and therefore there was no response to them. And that's an absolute mirroring of what occurred in the indictment infants in what occurred with the cases that Lucy found herself in court in relation to. There was a lack of attentiveness, they didn't spot the signs or they misdiagnosed, therefore they didn't take the right action, and sometimes there were medical errors as well where they did basic procedures badly. And all these things compounded together, and that is what caused the deaths at this hospital, just as the death of Oscar, the avoidable death of Oscar, was caused by medical incompetence. So the view of the neonatologist is that Oscar would have survived if the resuscitation had been better. So, contrary to what the court heard, that they made excellent efforts to resuscitate infants, as Dewey described it, this was just a failed resuscitation. The infant should have survived, even despite all the mistakes. This is what I mean about basic medical procedures. So, not only did they misdiagnose, not only was there a lack of attentiveness, not only was there poor treatment because of that, but then they did very fundamental processes, they got them wrong. And we saw that over and over again in the court case as well. It's just that this hasn't been properly explained to a jury by qualified people. This case should never be in court. The Lucy Letby case should never be in court. There should be an investigation into how all of these infants were allowed to decline and then meet their ultimate very sad demise. That's what should have happened. This channel should not exist. You should not know who I am. I should not be discussing this now. There should have been a medical investigation. That couldn't be any clearer now. So the neonatologist went on to say that the hospital took far too long to get a line in to ensure that Oscar received resuscitation drugs. And then we heard from a solicitor, Greg Almond, who is representing the family. And he said the following: I think there were failings, and I think the failings were really failings of delay and inactivity. And I think that proactive approach to maternity care is really important because every second counts. And so there has to be that level of urgency and the constant reviewing to make sure that if something is needed in terms of intervention, that it happens immediately. And it can't just be left. Our experts were very clear that had earlier action been taken, the outcome could have been very different. So in this situation, the decline and the clinical signs are very clear. However, I just want to mention that what he's talking about here, the lack of attention and how every second counts, that is important generally in terms of maternity and neonatology, but also in the indictment infants, because as I've been told by countless nurses, countless people who've worked on neonatal units, these infants deteriorate rapidly. They go from being perfectly okay to in a perilous position, as is mentioned here, within a matter of seconds. And that is why attentiveness and consultant presence and all of these things that we're discussing in this video are so important. And it's why the obvious deficit in these things is so critical in the outcome of both these the infants in this documentary and also the infants that were involved in the court case. So with regard to this avoidable death, Freya is one of many parents who have apparently struggled to extract information from the hospital due to the Lucy Letby case having drawn a veil around the hospital. That's something that the Countess of Chester had done themselves. And it's become harder and harder for parents to get legitimate information about a very serious situation here, the death of their child. So when you go back to the comment on the screen, my baby did not die of natural causes, he died of neglect, he died of systemic failings, and that is the reason why other babies are dying. If we go back and look at the indictment infants, just to give you 5 very simple examples immediately, in child C, they failed to identify a bowel obstruction. In child D, they failed to give antibiotics. In child E, they failed to deliver critical blood transfusion. In child I, there's very obvious failure of diagnosis. And in child O, there's misdiagnosis, medical error, and mistreatment of subcapsular hematoma. Now, we're going to discuss child O further as this video continues, but it's clear that, as I've reported in my book, as I've been told by Dr. Shu Lee, there are multiple errors in these infants and the errors compound one another. And that's exactly what we see in the avoidable death of Oscar. It is several errors compounding one another to create a terminal situation that simply should have been avoided. And it's clear that that has occurred also with the infants that were involved in the indictment against Lucy Letby. What ultimately happened on this unit in 2015 and 2016 was that Lucy was left often alone, and when not alone, in highly pressurised circumstances that were inadequate care for the infants that were on the unit, and she was left as being the first responder to the problems that inevitably ensued. She's there responding to incidents, raising the alarms, making the notes. We know she was the most diligent note taker, and now we know why. It's because of the problems they had on the unit, and she's paid the ultimate price for that, which is the loss of her liberty. So we then heard from another parent, Cath Hughes, who had been booked into the Countess of Chester Hospital to be induced. Now, it became clear from her interview that she experienced serious problems with vomiting that occurred well before it would be expected. And she said the hospital were dismissive of this. They said, it's not a serious issue. If you can't cope with this, you're not going to be able to cope with the pregnancy. But she said the pain was becoming unbearable at this point, and she was laid across the floor crying. And yet the midwife on the unit was dismissive of this problem. And she was in constant searing pain on the bed. And she reflected the parent, Cath, that the hospital didn't believe her. They don't believe me, she said. They don't believe something is happening, something is going wrong. You would have thought they had enough warnings by this point. But they were dismissive about the fact that anything was wrong. They were saying, nothing will be happening yet. You don't need to worry about it. Basically, you just need to toughen up, is what she was told. So the midwife did not examine her, and thus did not realise that Cath's body was responding unfavourably to drugs. And essentially, she was entering labour much more quickly than would be anticipated, what is described as spontaneous labour. And the situation got so bad that her partner, I can't recall if it was I presume it was her husband, but I'm not sure if it was her husband or just partner, but said to her, I thought I was going to lose you both. I thought I was going to lose the mother of the child and the child, that you were both going to die. And again, there was a complete lack of attentiveness. And Cath made the comment, we were so lucky, but we shouldn't have had to be lucky. So you can see again, this could clearly have escalated. Fortunately for them, it didn't. And Cath made the following comment. I feel like it was very clinical and textbook at the start. This is your first baby. Your baby's not coming yet, almost normalizing it. And I didn't trust them. I just didn't trust them, which is why I self-discharged that day. So that's an incredible thing when you think about it, that she felt safer not being in the hospital than being in the hospital due to what she'd seen on the unit. And her instinct, I would suggest, was absolutely correct. So Sue Pemberton, who's the Director of Nursing and Quality and Deputy Chief Executive Officer at the hospital, apologised unreservedly to families who had received poor care. And she said, if families feel concerns have not been addressed, then I would urge them to contact the trust. Now, what is significant about this, apart from the implications for these parents, is that there are multiple indictment parents who should be telephoning the trust tomorrow. Sue Pemberton claimed that the trust had made significant improvements since these problems occurred. That may very well be true, but this refers to the period 2015 to 2020 that goes right across the indictment period. We then went on to discuss the fact that full maternity notes were excluded from the trial. This is something I've discussed on the channel previously, and there was an appearance from Professor Phil Bennett, who's mentioned in my book, a professor of obstetrics and gynecology at Imperial College London, who's been an academic obstetrician for over 40 years. He's been instructed by the defence and he's the director of the Institute of Reproductive and Developmental Biology, a very senior obstetrician. So Professor Phil Bennett appeared in this documentary and made some important and illustrative comments. So Professor Bennett said the following: "It's very surprising indeed to me that little or no attention was paid to the maternity care in these cases, and I'm very surprised because these experts should know that to come to the right conclusion you need an integrated opinion in the National Health Service." So before we go any further, we know that the National Crime Agency advised Cheshire Police that they required a multidisciplinary integrated opinion as it's described here. We know what happened when they were advised that. Dr. Dewi Evans, who's going to appear shortly, told them we don't need any maternity information, we don't need any obstetric information. So Professor Bennett continues, when there's an adverse let me just say before I continue, the police shouldn't have listened to that. I'm not entirely placing the blame on Dr. Evans. The police shouldn't have listened. When there's an adverse outcome, you always involve discussions with the maternity and the obstetric team and the neonatologists. And in litigation cases where babies are harmed or babies die in the early neonatal period, there is always expert testimony from both obstetricians, midwives, and neonatologists. So he's describing the process that should take place in a hospital, but obviously it should take place in court. And more importantly, I don't even know why I'm talking about court. It should take place in the initial investigation of the infants. And I'm certain if competent people had gone into the police and it had been a competent multidisciplinary panel who had examined the notes properly, people of the calibre that are now involved in the international panel and effectively in the defence of Lucy Letby, they would have seen, well, there were multiple medical failings. Now, Dr. Evans didn't refer to any of these. We know this for a fact because the one criticism he made of the hospital, he claims himself, was with regard to the delay of antibiotics. That was the one thing he was able to cite. Now, I've discussed this in previous videos. I'm not sure that he even did cite that. He didn't meaningfully cite it in court because he downplayed it, and he never even brought it up. His barrister brought it up, and he sort of ummed and ahed and said, oh yeah, I think I put that in there. Because he was always entirely focused on malfeasance in the testimony that he gave in court. That's undeniable because we have the testimony in black and white. So all of these really obvious issues that are evident from the medical notes, Dr. Evans has discounted them completely. That's why Dr. Shu Lee was asking this question that was featured in the Channel 4 documentary of how did you manage to not mention or disregard all of the problems on the unit, all the mistakes that were made, etc., etc. And when, in response to that question, the only thing Dr. Evans could cite was a failure to give antibiotics that is doubtful that he even cited in the first place. And then he downplayed it and said that the treatment of the infant, the treatment of child D, said this in court, was excellent at the Countess of Chester Hospital. That's the only thing he's able to cite. So I don't want to speak for Professor Lee, but I suspect that the reason he's asked this question is because he's astounded that Dr. Evans could disregard or miss or discount or whatever it may be, however it could be described, all of these problems. So they then went on to discuss Child O, as I mentioned earlier. So Professor Bennett has seen the neonatal medical notes for Child O, but not the obstetric notes, because they weren't disclosed to the defence. Instead, he drew on testimony from a police interview with the baby's mother about the birth of the triplet. And the view of Professor Bennett is that the injury to the baby's liver was likely to have happened accidentally during the Caesarean section. So that's interesting, important, illustrative, because we've seen earlier in this video that they had serious problems with the Caesarean section. And that ultimately led to the sad demise of the infant Oscar discussed earlier. Let's just reiterate at this point that we're always told, or certainly around the time of the trial, the court was told there were no neonatal deaths. Suddenly there's a massive spike in neonatal deaths and we never had any more. We now know about multiple neonatal deaths that occurred in the years after Lucy was on the unit. So Professor Bennett goes on to discuss Child O further. So he stated, as I mentioned, that mistakes with the caesarean section were likely to have caused the death of the infant. And Professor Bennett cited this detail of a huge spray of blood having shot up from where the delivery was taking place and going over herself and her partner onto the wall behind in the operating theatre. So you've heard Dr. Martin Pittman, obstetrician, discuss this previously and say that it's extraordinary. I've heard another obstetrician cite this and say that it's very significant and indicative of major trauma and something that would be incredibly rare, that hardly ever happens. So Professor Bennett suggests that an obstetrician probably cut through a blood vessel and therefore they felt the need to deliver the babies as quickly as possible because the bleeding couldn't be stopped until in the placenta until the babies had been delivered. Delivery of triplets at 32 weeks is not an easy delivery, and it's easy to conceive that some damage could be done to those babies during the delivery. What again is important here is that the prosecution argued that Child O was born in good condition, which is completely untenable. Professor Bennett went on to say there's actually quite a lot of good literature around this. There are lots of papers and they've been published over the past 50 years. And if you go to the literature, what you find is that the way in which this condition commonly presents, the usual presentation is that it's caused by trauma at the time of delivery, but the baby is apparently well for between 1 and 7 days, with an average of around 48 hours. And then the baby suddenly collapses and will often die. My feeling is that the experts who gave evidence in the trial had not looked properly at that literature, and so did not know that this is the usual presentation of this condition. So he's saying they didn't look properly at the literature. Obviously, what is more likely is that they didn't look at it at all. So then Professor Bennett was asked a question. The neonatal notes and the testimony that you've based your opinion on, this was available during Lucy Letby's trial, so the jury would have heard arguments based on this. Do you not think that they made their decision based on this evidence? And he said in response to that, it would probably have required the expert evidence of an obstetrician to explain to the jury what these circumstances are and why there is a significant risk that the injury could have occurred during the delivery. More generally, I'm very surprised that nobody who gave expert evidence in the case thought to look at the maternity notes. So in response to this, we then heard from the inestimable insight and intellect of Dr. Dewi Evans, who said his usual thing, okay, well, I've not seen his report and I'd be interested to have a look at what he is saying. Well, why? Why do you need to see his report? Why should that be of any relevance, as if you need to rubber stamp his opinion? He's way, way, way more qualified than you, and unlike you, he's actually looked at the notes in relation to this. So you seeing his report is of no relevance whatsoever. I mean, he's made it absolutely clear what he's saying, so you don't need to see his report. All you need to do is respond to that, and all you can actually say is that you didn't see the maternity notes, you didn't see the obstetric notes, and not only did you make no effort to see them, but you actively discouraged the police from seeking them out. It's not unreasonable to suggest, Dr. Evans said, that there should have been an obstetric opinion, but it was not something that was ever discussed, and if the defence had concerns regarding the quality of the obstetric care, then they would be obliged to get themselves an obstetric opinion. I don't think that happened either. So I'm not going to go over this in great detail at this point in time because more stuff may come out in relation to this. All I can say is that it's clearly the duty of Dr. Evans to seek obstetric opinion himself. It's not it's his job to go in there and dispassionately and thoroughly examine the infants, not say, oh well, I said this, so now it's the job of the defence to untangle that. That obviously wouldn't happen in a medical situation and shouldn't happen in a medical situation. In a medical situation, if there have been deaths of infants, what you would do is the most thorough investigation possible. You shouldn't be saying, it's actually, the most generous thing I can possibly say is it's utterly untenable to sit there and say, oh well, I just didn't think we need to look at the obstetric notes, but hey, if the defence think it's an issue, then they should look at it. Laughable. So the documentary then explained that Cheshire Police did obtain the obstetric records of babies in this case. We've also learned from several sources that the Crown Prosecution Service didn't disclose these obstetric records to the defence, and they say that's because the prosecution didn't use them to form the case against Letby, so they weren't relevant. And we found out that the defence did request these documents, that they did feel they were relevant, but they were never allowed to see them. So this is critically important, and this is something that will come up again in the future. There's going to be more stuff that will come out in relation to this. So then the following exchange took place between the interviewer and presenter of the programme and Dr. Evans. Do you think the obstetrics care was relevant in the Letby cases? Is that something that you looked into? I don't think that maternity care was a particular issue in the Letby case. How do you know? You never looked at the maternity notes or the obstetric notes. It's completely impossible for you to make that opinion. That's why you're saying, I don't think. You can't say it wasn't because you have no idea. How can you possibly have an idea? You didn't look at it in the first place. I think most of the babies I dealt with were born in acceptable condition with one or two exceptions. So this is kind of carefully chosen language, you might describe it as, like acceptable condition. What does that actually mean? What does acceptable condition mean? Because in the case of Oscar, for example, Oscar could have been saved. So you could argue Oscar was born in acceptable condition. That doesn't mean that there weren't massive mistakes made, because there very obviously were. So to say that they were born in acceptable condition is ridiculous. Then he says there's one or two exceptions. So which exceptions were these? Because in the court, you never expressed that impression. When did you say during the court case this baby was really vulnerable and it's understandable that this baby experienced problems, passed away, etc., etc.? When did that happen exactly? So then the interview goes on to say, and did you look at the obstetric notes? No. Okay, did the police offer them to you? No. No one asked for the obstetric notes, and I think if I had seen the obstetric notes, I don't think it would have made much difference. How do you know? How do you know? So you don't think maternity care was an issue, and you don't think the obstetric notes would have made an issue, but you haven't seen either of them. Details regarding the labour and the delivery and any significant maternal history was documented in the baby notes anyway. So I'll just mention with regard to that, I've addressed this in my book. I've addressed this in chapter 17. Okay, and is that a short few paragraphs, or what form does it take? It's usually a couple of paragraphs, so it's clearly not a full impression then. I asked if he felt the full note should have been disclosed to the defence. So Evan says, I never saw any obstetric notes, we're aware of that, and I've no idea what happened to them. Oh, really? But the CPS should simply have said, well, the Crown is not using obstetric notes, but you're welcome to have them. With the benefit of hindsight, would that have made a difference to the outcome? I don't think so. I mean, the events that occurred to these babies were events that occurred after they were born. So I can't fully comment on this at this point in time. All I will say is that the hole that Dr. Evans has dug himself is getting deeper and deeper and deeper. So there was then a concluding section in which it was explained again that Lucy's case has been a barrier to parents getting the truth, and there was a kind of generic statement read out from the Crown Prosecution Service, which I'm not going to repeat because I think it was disgusting and disgraceful and showed a complete disregard for the parents of these infants. Finally, Mark McDonald has released a statement that I'm going to read out in full. This is a devastating programme that raises profound questions about the standard of care within the maternity services at the Countess of Chester Hospital. It reinforces concerns that the problems at the hospital extended far beyond the neonatal unit. During Lucy Letby's trial, the jury never received the complete obstetric picture concerning the health of the babies. That evidence was not properly explored, and it is becoming increasingly apparent that serious systemic failings existed within the hospital itself. Families were let down. Babies died who should not have died. Those families deserve the truth about what happened, wherever that truth leads. The emerging evidence is yet another example of why Lucy Letby's convictions must be urgently reconsidered. When the wider clinical context is properly examined, the case against her becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. So I want to point you to comments that I made during my interview at Waterstones, where I said, I don't think we've heard the half of the story yet. Now, I don't want to claim some incredible perceptiveness here because I knew this was coming. But even what we've heard here today in relation to this new documentary and the new revelations associated with it, I still think that we still haven't heard half the story. This still doesn't represent half the story. There'll be a lot more to come. When this finally unravels, when we get the full story of what occurred at the Countess of Chester Hospital, it's going to be a very damning, very chilling, very troubling story. So this documentary was not enjoyable to listen to. It was pretty upsetting, really. And I would imagine it would have been a lot more upsetting for people that have spent time on maternity units, spent time on neonatal units, who've been through labour and so on and so forth. It doesn't require an enormous amount of summary, except to say that what we see in these cases, these harrowing cases that have been skillfully discussed in this documentary, is the same pattern of poor care, the same lack of consultant presence, and the obvious medical errors that are evident in the Lucy Letby case. There's the same issues at the hospital, the same glaringly obvious maternity issues, the same outcomes for the infants. We're seeing very similar things in the indictment infants to what we're seeing in these cases. It's becoming increasingly clear that what occurred at the Countess of Chester is part of a broader maternity crisis, and it is now incumbent on Cheshire Police to release the obstetric notes if, as they repeatedly claim, they truly care about the parents. Finally, if you're new to this channel, you may not be aware that I've written a book on the Lucy Letby case that's been published in the last couple of weeks. It's entitled Reasonable Doubt, Examining the Case of Lucy Letby. It's available through Amazon, Waterstones, other retailers, and the publisher, which is Cinto Press, spelt C-I-N-T-O. And this book outlines and documents all of the problems with the hospital, everything that was discussed in this documentary. This is just more detail and more indication, filling in even further still the picture and the impression and the very evidential issues that there were at that hospital, on that maternity unit, with the treatment of infants, that are documented both in the book and in the over 850 references that I've compiled that are available online. And this document is just giving us this documentary is giving us more detail, more information, more testimony to indicate that everything that is said in that book is true. So if you're interested in reading more about the Countess of Chester, more about the indictment issues, and more about why the conviction of Lucy Letby is chronically unsafe, then you can read this book and you can find out the full picture. With that being said, if you have any comments, queries, or other observations, please do leave them in the comment section. This was not a pleasant video to make. It's horrible to learn of more problems. It's horrible to learn of more issues with infants and parents. This needs to be sorted out. It needs to be sorted out quickly. It's very obvious that Lucy Letby has done nothing wrong, that she was doing the best that she could on a failing unit. That's blindingly obvious now to anyone. That's why every serious, incredible person that looks at this case comes to the same conclusion. It's why there are zero credible or serious people that are claiming the prosecution case is sound and that it's a safe conviction. And no one is ever going to come forward now, and there's just going to be more and more and more qualified medical people with relevant expertise, who are going to say this is an unsafe conviction, and it will get bigger and bigger, and eventually Lucy Letby will be exonerated. That has to come sooner rather than later, because, as I said at Waterstones, this is a debacle and a national embarrassment.